3 years at sea, every day written down, and the date was still wrong. July 1522. A Spanish ship limps into a Portuguese harbour with most of her crew dead of hunger and sends a boat ashore to buy food. Almost as an afterthought, the men in that boat are told to ask what day it is. The answer comes back: Thursday. Aboard, everyone is certain it's Wednesday. The man who kept the ship's journal wrote one flat line about that moment: "We knew not how we had fallen into error." His name was Antonio Pigafetta, and he had written down the date every single day of the voyage, in health, without a break. Nobody had skipped a day. Nobody could find a day to skip. So one of two things was true. Either the most careful record any European had ever kept at sea was worthless, or the world was doing something nobody in Europe had ever written down. There were 18 of them left. Most couldn't read. Within weeks, they'd be standing in a room in Castile in front of the emperor's scholars, and this missing day was the one thing they had that nobody could take away from them. How does a starving sailor who can't write his own name win an argument like that against the best educated men in Europe? If this is your kind of story, subscribe and leave a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Because that's exactly the question this ship dragged home with it. Whose clock is right? And how would you ever prove it? The harbour was Ribeira Grande, on the island of Santiago in the Cape Verdes. Portuguese soil, Portuguese guns, and the ship creeping in under them was Spanish and had no business being there. She was called the Victoria. Her hull leaked so badly the pumps ran in shifts around the clock, and if the pumping stopped for long, she went down. Between the island of Timor and this anchorage, 15 Europeans and 10 men from the Moluccas had died aboard her. The survivors were still 2,000 miles from home, with nothing left to eat. So they lied. The boat went in with a story. They were a Spanish trader coming back from the Americas. They'd lost their foremast under the equator. They were repairing it, and their captain general had gone on ahead to Spain with the other 2 ships. It was a good lie. It explained the wreck of a ship, the state of the men, and the absence of anyone in charge. It also happened to be half true, which is usually what makes a lie work. They had lost a mast, only not at the equator. They'd lost it off the Cape of Good Hope. The Portuguese sold them rice, 2 boatloads of it, and that was the moment somebody remembered to ask about the date. You can see why they asked. Sunday matters when you've made vows at sea. Feast days matter. Fast days matter. And these men had been keeping them by a calendar that turned out to be 1 square off. What you can't see yet is why it mattered to anyone on shore, or why, a year later, the sharpest minds in Europe would still be arguing about it. To understand that, you have to know what these ships had been sent out to do. And it was never to sail around the world. Nobody had ordered that. Nobody had even suggested it. The orders in the strongbox were about something much narrower and much stranger. A line drawn on the far side of the planet that no living person had ever seen, or measured, or could find. In 1494, Spain and Portugal had divided the ocean between them. A line was agreed in the Atlantic, west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything newly found to the west of it belonged to Castile. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal, and the Pope blessed the arrangement. For a while that was enough, because both crowns were busy in places that were obviously on one side or the other. Then the Portuguese reached the Moluccas. Cloves grew on a handful of small volcanic islands in eastern Indonesia and nowhere else on Earth. Not in India, not in China, not anywhere a European could reliably get to. Everything Europe put in its wine and its meat and its medicine came from those few square miles of hillside, passed hand to hand through a dozen middlemen until the price at the far end was ludicrous. Whoever held the islands set the price of cloves in Antwerp. The problem was the line itself. The one agreed in 1494 ran through the Atlantic. A line on a globe doesn't stop. Continue it around the back of the world, and it comes up somewhere in the Pacific, and it cuts the eastern hemisphere in half, exactly as it cut the western one. So the entire quarrel came down to a single question. On which side of that continuation did the Clove Islands sit? Nobody knew. Nobody could know, because nobody could measure longitude. Latitude was easy enough. Measure the height of the sun at noon, or the pole star at night. Check the tables, and you have your distance from the equator. It's reading a ruler. Longitude was a different animal entirely. To know how far east or west you'd come, you had to know what time it was, at that exact instant, in the city you'd sailed from 3 years earlier. There was no clock on Earth that could survive a sea voyage and still be trusted. There wouldn't be one for another 2.5 centuries. Which meant the richest territorial dispute in Europe rested on a number that no one could produce. Magellan's original partner in the scheme was an astronomer, and he had written a treatise proposing 3 ways around the problem. One involved the compass and the way it drifts off true north. He liked that one best. It's a dead end. Once the fleet was at sea, Magellan put the treatise to his pilots and asked whether they could actually navigate by it. They wrote out their answer and signed their names to it. No, it couldn't be used. The fleet's own astrologer agreed with them, with one exception. He thought you could get somewhere by measuring the moon against another body in the sky. Astronomers knew that method. It works. On a moving deck, it's almost impossible. As for the man in command, Ferdinand Magellan was Portuguese, in his late 30s, and by any ordinary reading of a career, finished. He'd served in India and at the taking of Malacca. In Morocco, he took a lance wound that left him limping for the rest of his life. Then came an accusation of trading with the enemy. It was investigated and dropped, and after that, nobody in Lisbon offered him anything. He asked his king for a small raise in his allowance and a command. He was refused. He asked again, refused again. He asked for permission to seek employment elsewhere, and the king told him he could go wherever he liked. So in the autumn of 1517, he arrived in Seville with no Spanish, no money, and no connections. Inside a year, he had married the daughter of a Portuguese official in the Spanish trade house, which solved all 3 problems at once. Her father knew the men who decided which voyages sailed. Before he left, he had a will drawn up, the way you do. He also arranged, by royal order, that his monthly salary would be paid directly to his wife in Seville while he was away, so that she'd have money coming in every month of a 3-year absence. What the Crown actually thought of this venture is in the accounts. 5 ships were bought second-hand. The Victoria cost 800 gold ducats, and her owners took the price unwillingly because the expedition's own accountant valued her higher than that. A Portuguese agent in Seville, watching the refit and reporting home, wrote that he wouldn't cross to the Canaries in ships in that condition. Provisions came to nearly as much as the entire fleet had cost. 270 men were signed on, give or take, and the sources don't agree on the exact figure. Castilians, Portuguese, Italians, Greeks, Frenchmen, Germans, at least 2 Englishmen. Spanish officials made Magellan cut the number of Portuguese aboard, because a Portuguese commander with a Portuguese crew was a fleet that could sail anywhere it liked. They gave him instead 3 Castilian gentlemen as captains, appointed to watch him. The fleet was in trouble before it cleared the mouth of the Guadalquivir. Now stand on a beach in Patagonia at the end of March 1520. The bay is a long, gray inlet with low cliffs and no trees. The wind comes off the land hard enough to lean on, and the water is full of seals. Behind you, 5 months of winter. In front of you, 4 ships at anchor, and the certainty that there is no way through this continent anywhere you've looked. Because you've looked. All the way down from Brazil, and every promising gap has closed into a river. Magellan named it Port Saint Julian, put the fleet on reduced rations, and announced they'd wait out the winter and keep searching in spring. The Castilian captains wanted to turn the ships around. They moved on Easter night, the 1st of April. Around midnight, 30 armed men crossed in a skiff and boarded the San Antonio, the biggest ship in the fleet. They took her captain, Magellan's own cousin, and locked him in a cabin. The ship's master, a Basque seaman, stood in front of them and demanded in the name of God and the king that they let him out. One of the mutineer captains drew a dagger and stabbed him about 6 times and left him bleeding on the deck. He didn't die there. He was carried below and he lived, and he seemed to recover. And then the wound turned, and he died of it 3 months later, ashore, in that bay. By dawn, the mutineers held 3 ships out of 5. What Magellan did next was cheap and ruthless. He sent his master-at-arms across to the Victoria in an open launch with 2 rowers, no weapons showing, calling up that he carried a message from the Captain General to her captain. They let him aboard. The captain took him below to his cabin, read the message, and laughed in his face. The master-at-arms put a dagger into his throat, and the marine who'd come with him finished it with a blow to the skull. Then he took the lantern off the desk and held it to the cabin window and swung it back and forth. A longboat that had been sitting out in the dark came alongside. 15 or 16 more men were over the rail before the Victoria's crew understood what was happening, and that crew put up no fight at all. Which was probably the point. Hers was the least Castilian crew in the fleet. Magellan had picked his target. After that, he moved his ships across the harbor mouth and waited. Before dawn on the 3rd, the San Antonio drifted within reach and was boarded, and they found her captain up on the quarterdeck in full armor, with a lance and a shield, waiting for a fight that 30 men had already lost. The trial ran 5 days and was presided over by the cousin who'd been locked in the cabin. 40 men were condemned to death. Almost all of them were then reprieved and set to hard labor in chains for the rest of the winter, because 40 dead men is a fleet that can't sail. One captain went to the block, and the executioner was his own servant and foster brother, who took the job in exchange for a pardon. The bodies of that captain and the one killed aboard the Victoria were drawn, quartered, and set up on stakes above the beach, and left there for the rest of their stay. 58 years later, Francis Drake put into the same bay and found the gibbet still standing. He then tried one of his own officers for mutiny on that shore, and had him beheaded. There's no good explanation for that. Some bays are just unlucky. In August, before sailing, Magellan had the ringleader who'd survived, one of the Castilian captains, put ashore on a small island with a priest who'd backed him and left them there with a supply of biscuit and wine. That was the sentence. Nobody ever heard of either of them again. One more man was pulled into it. The fleet's cosmographer, the astrologer, the one who understood the sky better than anyone aboard, was suspected of knowing about the plot. They tied his arms behind his back, ran the rope over a beam, and hauled him off the ground by his own shoulders. The word for it is strappado. Then they untied him and put him straight back to work, because there was nobody else who could do it. A few weeks later, he was down on that beach with his instruments, taking sights on the sky and writing numbers in a book. By early May, the smallest ship in the fleet was patched up and ready, and Magellan sent her south alone to look for the way through. She was the Santiago, a caravel with about 30-odd men aboard, and she found an estuary full of seals and penguins that they named Santa Cruz. They stayed 2 weeks and killed and roasted seals, and it was, briefly, the best fortnight anyone in that fleet had. Then they put to sea again on the 22nd and ran straight into a storm that tore the sails away and ripped the rudder off. With no steering left, her captain got a spare sail up and drove her bow first onto a beach. Every man got off. The ship broke up. Then they had to walk. 30-odd sailors, in Patagonian winter, along a coast where the previous Spanish expedition down this way had lost a landing party to an attack on a beach in full view of their own ships. It took them 4 days to get back to the estuary. From there, 2 of the youngest were sent on ahead on foot, and they walked for the better part of 2 weeks before they reached the fleet. Magellan sent 20 men back overland, carrying bread and wine. 5 weeks after the wreck, the rescue party reached the survivors. It was at Saint Julian that the giants turn up. Pigafetta describes a man appearing on the shore, naked, dancing and singing, and throwing sand over his own head. And he writes that the Europeans came up only to his waist. 2 young men were taken by a trick, iron shackles offered as gifts and then closed on their ankles, and both died at sea later. It's usually told as either fact or nonsense, and it's neither. The people were almost certainly Tehuelche, and Tehuelche men were genuinely tall, well above the height of a Spanish crew of that decade. That difference is real, and it is nowhere close to waist height. Some historians think the name Magellan gave them, Patagones, came out of a Spanish chivalric romance featuring a monster called Patagon, a book he'd very likely read. What the sources do not give us, anywhere, is what these people called themselves. On the 21st of October, the fleet raised a headland that Magellan named for the 11,000 virgins, whose feast day it was, and behind it there was an opening. The water in it was salt all the way in, and the tide ran hard, and it kept going. It took them 38 days to get through. Not a channel so much as a flooded mountain range, side arms that opened wide and hopeful and then closed into cliffs, currents that ran the wrong way, depths where an anchor found no bottom. At night there were fires burning along the southern shore, so they called that side the Land of Fire, and the name stuck. Somewhere in the middle of it, Magellan did something a commander only does when he already knows the answer. He issued a written order requiring every officer to set down his opinion in writing, signed. Go on or turn back. Concepcion and Victoria said, go on. The single voice against came from the San Antonio's pilot, a Portuguese who had proposed his own Western expedition back in Seville and lost the commission to Magellan, and had not forgiven it. On the 3rd day, the boat came back. Magellan had sent it ahead, well provisioned, to find the far end. 3 days later, it returned with the news that there was a cape, and beyond the cape, open sea. Pigafetta says the Captain General wept. He named that headland the Cape of Desire for the thing he'd wanted so long, and on the 28th of November they sailed past it into an ocean no European had entered from this side. The San Antonio was not with them. She'd been sent to scout a side channel and had never come back. They searched for her. They lit signal fires on the heights and left messages buried at the foot of marked posts and burned days they couldn't spare. Nothing. What had happened was this. The pilot and the ship's clerk overpowered the captain, put him in irons, and then forced him, under torture, to sign a statement that Magellan had tortured and murdered Castilian officers in Patagonia. They put a Castilian in nominal command, because a mutinied ship coming home looks better under a Castilian, turned around, felt their way back out through the strait and set course across the Atlantic. They did not stop at the island to look for the marooned captain. They had aboard the largest share of the fleet's remaining provisions. The San Antonio reached Seville in May of 1521, with 55 men and a story. And for the next year and a half, that story was the only account of this voyage that existed anywhere in Europe. It had been written by the men who abandoned it, and it was believed. The ocean on the other side was supposed to be small. Every globe in Europe, every map Magellan had argued from in front of the king, showed a modest stretch of water between the back of the Americas and the edge of Asia. Days of sailing, maybe a couple of weeks. Europe thought the world was smaller than it is, and the gap on the far side was the part nobody had any evidence about. So the map makers drew it small, because small was convenient. They were at sea for 98 days before they saw anything worth landing on. Stand on the deck about 6 weeks in. Look up at the mainyard, the big horizontal spar the mainsail hangs from, and you'll see bare wood where there used to be leather. Ox hides were nailed there to stop the yard chewing through the rigging every time it swung. Those hides had been up there in sun and salt and wind for over a year, and they'd gone hard as roof tile. The crew cut them down, dragged them over the side on ropes, and left them trailing in the sea for 4 or 5 days until the salt water softened them enough to bend. Then they laid them on the embers and ate them. That was one of the better meals. The biscuit had stopped being biscuit. Weevils had eaten out everything worth eating, and what was left was a powder full of grubs that stank of rat urine. Because rats had been living in the barrels and doing what rats do. The water in the casks had gone yellow and thick. Men chewed sawdust scraped off the planking, which does nothing for you, but chewing is chewing. And they ate the rats, when they could catch them. A rat sold for half a ducat aboard those ships, and Pigafetta notes that even at that price, you often couldn't get one. Run the arithmetic on that. An apprentice seaman on the Victoria drew 800 maravedis a month. Half a ducat is about a week of his wages, for one rat paid to a shipmate. Then the gums start. Scurvy is what happens when a body runs out of vitamin C and can no longer hold its own connective tissue together. Old scars split open, teeth loosen, and the gums swell up over the crowns of the teeth so that a man physically cannot chew. So in the last stage of a starvation voyage, men were dying of hunger with food in front of them that they were unable to eat. Pigafetta counted 19 dead on the crossing. Other accounts put it nearer 30. Both numbers are in the sources, and they don't agree. The geography is the cruelty here. The Pacific holds thousands of islands. Thousands. The fleet crossed the widest part of it and threaded, by pure bad luck, straight down a corridor between archipelagos. They raised exactly 2 scraps of land in 3 months, both bare, both uninhabited, both offering no anchorage and nothing to eat. They named them the Unfortunate Islands and sailed on. By the time they crossed the equator, the food was effectively gone. On the 6th of March, 1521, they raised Guam. Canoes came out fast. They were outrigger craft, the flying proas, and they sailed circles around 3 European ships, which the Spanish noticed and wrote about with something close to professional envy. The islanders came aboard and started taking things, on the reasonable understanding that when strangers arrive on your beach, goods move. Somebody cut loose the skiff that was towed astern of the flagship and took it. Magellan put 40 armed men ashore. They burned 40 or 50 houses and a number of boats, killed 7 men, and took the skiff back. Then the fleet left, and left a name behind. The Islands of Thieves. That name sat on the Marianas for a century and a half. The village on Guam, traditionally identified with that landing, was officially renamed Humatak in 2021, 500 years to the year. A week and a half later, they anchored off another island in another archipelago, and a canoe came out, and one of the men in it spoke, and the interpreter standing on the flagship's deck understood him. The island was Homonhon in the eastern Visayas. 9 men came across with fish, coconuts, bananas, and a jar of palm wine, and would not take payment. Accounts of the voyage say Magellan had coconut water carried to the sick himself. Whatever the exact truth of that, the effect is not in dispute. Men who had been dying of scurvy for weeks were put in front of fresh fruit and fresh water, and within days, some of them got up. The interpreter was a man called Enrique. Magellan had taken him at the sack of Malacca about a decade earlier, and kept him ever since. Through Portugal, through Spain, across 2 oceans. And now, people were answering him. What language it was is genuinely argued over. Most historians think it was Malay, which worked as a trade language across the whole region, so the exchange proves less than it looks. Some Filipino scholars have argued the man came from these islands to begin with, and was speaking a local tongue. What isn't argued is that after 10 years and most of the way around the planet, a man who had been carried west as property could stand on a deck and be understood. On the 31st of March, on a small island, they held Mass on the shore. That was Easter Sunday. Which island has been fought over in the Philippines for the better part of a century, with 2 cities each holding that it happened on their patch of coast. It got reopened by a national panel of historians and settled in 2020 in favor of Limasawa. And in the same ruling, the panel moved the site. Not the spot on Limasawa that had been marked and commemorated for decades, but a different point, a couple of kilometers along the same island. 5 centuries later, they're still adjusting the pin. Cebu is where the voyage stops looking like a trade mission. The Raja there received them, and Magellan and he swore friendship. Within days, the Raja was baptized, then his wife, then his household, then, according to Pigafetta, most of the island. Hundreds at first, then more. A cross went up on high ground. A carved wooden figure of the Christ child was given to the Raja's wife, and that figure is still in Cebu, in a basilica, the oldest Christian relic in the country. Nothing in the fleet's orders authorized any of this. Magellan had been told to find a route, load spices, and come home. Instead, he was baptizing kings and building himself something that looked a lot like a lordship. Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who published a full-scale demolition of the Magellan legend in 2022, reads him at this point as a man in the grip of something religious, a would-be holy man who had convinced himself the voyage was providential. That's one historian's reading, and other historians push back on it hard. What isn't a reading is the paperwork. He was doing things nobody had authorized. Across a narrow channel lay Mactan. The ruler there, Lapu-Lapu, would not accept the Raja of Cebu's overlordship and would not pay tribute to a king he had never heard of. Magellan sent a demand. The reply came back that they had lances of bamboo hardened in the fire and stakes dried in the fire, and that he could come whenever he liked. He chose Saturday. Pigafetta says he wanted Saturday specifically because Saturday was his lucky day. So, 3 hours before dawn on the 27th of April, 1521, in 3 boats, in the dark, off a beach on Mactan. When the light comes up, you can see the problem. The tide is out. Between the boats and the shore, there is a coral reef, roughly a mile wide, ankle deep to waist deep, and no boat can cross it. So the ship's guns, the only real advantage these men have, are sitting out beyond the reef at the far edge of their range, firing at nothing useful. And every man who goes ashore has to walk that mile, then walk it back. The Rajah of Cebu had offered to come with his own warriors. Magellan told him to stay in the boats and watch. 11 men stayed with the boats. 49 went into the water. Waiting on the beach, drawn up in 3 divisions, were something in the order of 1,500. What decided it was a detail about clothing. The Spanish wore steel helmets and steel breastplates. Below the waist, nothing. Armor is heavy and expensive, and you protect the head and the trunk. And against European infantry, that's a defensible choice. The men on Mactan worked it out within minutes. Pigafetta writes that the arrows and the fire-hardened bamboo came in low, at the legs, over and over, and that the Spanish couldn't reach them with crossbow or arquebus fire because their shot glanced off the shields. Magellan tried to break the deadlock by sending men to burn houses. It brought out more defenders, angrier ones. The fight ran a little over an hour. His helmet was knocked off his head twice. A bamboo spear caught him in the face, and he killed the man who threw it, and left his own lance standing in the body, which meant he no longer had a lance. He reached for his sword, and could draw it only halfway, because a spear had gone through his arm. Then a blade opened his left leg, and he went down, face first, into the water. Pigafetta was in the water too, wounded by a poisoned arrow to the face, working his way back toward the boats. He turned and watched it happen, and he later called the man on the ground there our true guide. 8 Spaniards died with him. 4 of the newly baptized Cebuano allies were killed as well by mortar fire from the boats. Pigafetta puts the losses on the other side at 15. Afterwards, the Cebuanos sent word offering as much merchandise as Mactan cared to name in exchange for the bodies. The offer was refused. Magellan's body was never handed over, and no source records what became of it. One honest caveat about that hour: every word we have describing it was written by men who were standing in the water, losing, and looking the wrong way. There is no account from the other side of that beach, because nobody there was writing. Meanwhile, in Seville, an entirely separate disaster was working itself out on paper, and this one had no violence in it at all. The trial of the deserters had been running for 6 months. Almost every man who testified had a reason to blacken the missing commander, and the story that came out of it was that Magellan had tortured and murdered Castilian officers in Patagonia and had been sailing outside his orders. The one man who contradicted it was the captain who'd been put in irons, and he'd already been tortured into signing a statement backing the mutineers, which did nothing for his credibility. In the end, nobody was charged. The mutineers walked. The captain who'd stayed loyal was held in prison for another year, and the Crown's Trade House looked at the file and made an administrative decision. Magellan's salary, the one he had arranged by royal order to be paid every month directly to his wife, was stopped. The wording in the record is that this was done considering the outcome of the voyage. She was then placed under house arrest with their small son on the orders of the archbishop who presided over the Indies. Both of Magellan's children died young. She died in 1522, before the survivors came home. The arrangement he had made to keep money going into that house for 3 years ran for about 18 months, and was then switched off by the same office that had set it up. You could tell this whole story as that tragedy, and it would be a good story. It still wouldn't be what the fleet was sent for. The fleet was sent to bring home a number, and the number was still unmeasured. Measuring it in 1520 took 4 things. You need a printed set of tables predicting where the moon will be, night by night, hour by hour, as seen from a fixed reference city. You need an event you can see and time, the moment the moon lines up with a bright planet or a bright star. You observe that alignment. Note your own local time from the sun or the stars, and compare it with the hour the tables say it happened back home. The difference between the 2 clocks is your distance around the globe. That's the whole idea. It's correct. It's how the problem finally got solved 2.5 centuries later. The trouble is the moon. It slides against the background stars at roughly its own width per hour. Get the observation wrong by a few minutes, and you've thrown your position out by degrees, which at that latitude is hundreds of miles. You need a steady horizon, a steady instrument, and a steady deck. And a ship at sea has none of those. You also need a night when the alignment is actually visible from where you happen to be floating, which is why the fleet's pilots had signed their names to a document saying it couldn't be done. The cosmographer disagreed, and at Port Saint Julian, he had 5 months of solid ground under him and nothing else to do. He waited for his conjunction, set up on the beach, took his sights and worked it through. His answer put that bay a little over 60 degrees west of Seville. The real figure is under a degree from that. Nobody else on any European ship in that century was getting within a degree of anything. His fellow pilots, working by dead reckoning, were routinely out by 10, 15, 20. This was a genuinely different order of accuracy, produced on a beach in Patagonia by a man who a few weeks earlier had been hanging by his own arms from a beam. And it was quietly ignored. A Portuguese chronicler, writing later in the century with expedition papers in front of him, reports what the pilots did with the cosmographer's results. His figures kept putting the fleet further east than theirs did, and further east was the wrong direction politically, because the whole legal case rested on the Clove Islands falling on Spain's side of that invisible line. So the pilots wrote down positions that suited the case, and set the coastlines where they wanted them, and not where he found them. Read that again, slowly. The single most accurate navigational measurement made anywhere on that voyage was overruled, on the ship, by men filling in the answer the Crown wanted. In 2024, a study in The Journal of Navigation went back and reconstructed the whole thing. The researchers took all 6 of his surviving longitude determinations, rebuilt the sky over him using modern ephemerides, and worked out what he must have observed and where each result went right or wrong. 2 of the 6 came out remarkably accurate. 4 did not. And the 2 good ones were good because separate errors in his tables and his method happened to point in opposite directions and cancel each other out. I'll be honest about what that does and doesn't mean, because it's easy to run it the wrong way. It does not make him a fluke. He was doing the one thing the professionals had declared impossible, on the one method that actually works. And he was the rare man aboard who was both a real astronomer and a real seaman. What it does mean is that his famous figure can't be held up as proof that the method was ready. He was right, and he was also lucky. And those 2 things sit together uncomfortably, which is usually a sign you're looking at something real. And a year later, a handful of half-starved sailors from this same fleet would be asked to defend a measurement of their own in front of men who did this for a living. They had no instruments at all. He never got to argue any of it. He didn't come home, and his notebooks and charts went into Portuguese hands. Around the year 1600, a Spanish royal chronicler had those papers on his desk and quoted from them at length in his history, which is the only reason we know any of the numbers at all. Then the originals disappear from the record entirely, and nobody has seen them since. The best measurement anyone on that fleet made survives only as somebody else's paraphrase. 4 days after the reef, the fleet was still anchored off Cebu, and the men who had taken over were dealing with a problem they didn't understand. Command had gone to 2 of the officers jointly, one of them Magellan's brother-in-law. Neither of them spoke a word of any language spoken on that coast. Everything they knew about where they were, who their allies were, and what was being said around them came through one man. That man was Enrique. He'd been wounded on the reef, and afterwards he lay in the ship under a blanket and would not get up. The brother-in-law came and told him he could stop imagining he was free. His master's death changed nothing. When they reached Spain, he would still belong to the widow, and if he didn't get up and go ashore and interpret, he'd be flogged. Something was sitting in a notary's file in Seville while that conversation happened. Magellan had made a will before the fleet sailed. In it, he set down that Enrique was to be free from the moment of his own death, released from all obligation, at liberty to go wherever he wished. He was also to be given 10,000 maravedis for his keep. The document existed. It had been witnessed. And it was on the other side of the world. Enrique got up and went ashore. On the 1st of May, the Raja of Cebu sent an invitation. Come to a feast, bring the officers, and collect the jewels he was sending home as a gift for the King of Spain. Something between 24 and 30 men went. Pigafetta stayed aboard because his face was still swollen from the arrow wound, and that is the only reason there's an account of what happened next. Partway through the meal, the doors were held, and the guests were killed. Around 26 died in the compound, including most of the fleet's remaining officers and the cosmographer. One of the two commanders was taken alive. They brought him down to the water's edge, wounded, bound, stripped. And he called out across to the ships that if they'd send merchandise ashore, he'd be ransomed. The ships were already getting underway. They fired their guns into the settlement and stood out to sea. And the man in charge of that decision was a kinsman of the man standing on the beach. He left him there. Pigafetta writes that they could hear him still calling. Why it happened at all has 3 separate contemporary answers, and they don't reconcile. Pigafetta blames the officers and hints that Enrique arranged the whole thing out of spite. A German secretary at the imperial court, writing within a year from interviews with survivors, was told the trouble had started with how Enrique was handled after his master died. And a survivor questioned back in Spain gave a blunter answer that has nothing to do with interpreters at all. The crews had been taking the local women, and the Cebuanos had had enough. Take your pick. Historians have been picking for 400 years. What no document does is follow Enrique off that beach. He walks out of the record on the 1st of May, 1521, in Cebu, and every version of what became of him after that is somebody's guess. They came away with 108 men and 3 ships, which was about 2 ships too many. On the 2nd of May, they anchored off Bohol and did the arithmetic. 3 hulls, 108 men, half of them sick. You cannot work 3 ships with that. So they moved everything portable off the Concepcion, every gun, every barrel, every foot of rope. Then they set her on fire and watched her burn to the waterline, so that nothing usable would be left on that shore for anyone else. Then came 6 months with no shape to them. The senior surviving officer took command, and what followed was not exploration. They wandered. They went to Palawan, to Brunei, up and down coasts, looking for someone who could tell them where the Clove Islands actually were. They stopped a passing junk and robbed it, and kept some of the people aboard, including women, and the commander kept some of them for himself. In September, the officers voted him out of the command. The paperwork for that vote survives, which tells you these men were still, in the middle of nowhere, running a bureaucracy. The Basque who came out of that reshuffle as captain of the Victoria was a man who had been condemned to death in Patagonia and pardoned into chains for the winter. His name was Juan Sebastián Elcano. On the 8th of November, 1521, they anchored at Tidore. They had made it. And what happened at the islands they'd crossed the planet for is, for the most part, shopping. The Sultan came out in a boat and was friendly. The trading went on for weeks, and Pigafetta wrote the prices down, which is the most useful thing anyone on that voyage did with a pen. A sack of cloves went for an armful of good red cloth. The Victoria took on 381 sacks. The ruler of a neighboring island sent something else along for the emperor: 2 dead birds, dried and prepared, with feathers unlike anything in Europe. The islanders who prepared skins for trade cut the legs off as a matter of routine, because the legs weren't the valuable part and the skin traveled better without them. So the birds went into the hold without feet, addressed to a king. By December, there were 2 ships and 2 theories about how to get home. The flagship couldn't sail. She'd sprung a serious leak, and finding it meant unloading her completely and hauling her over on the beach, and that would take months. So they split. The Victoria would go west, the long way, through Portuguese water, and take her chances. The Trinidad would be repaired, and then go back the way they'd come, east across the Pacific to the Spanish coast of Panama. On paper, the eastward route was the sensible one. It stayed in waters the Crown could claim. It avoided every Portuguese fort between here and Lisbon, and they'd already crossed that ocean once. They sailed on the 6th of April, 1522, with 50-odd men, and steered northeast to get above the trade winds and find westerlies that would push them home. The westerlies are up there. They are not up there in April. The North Pacific High sits in the wrong place that time of year, and what the Trinidad found instead was headwinds, then storms, then cold. They pushed north to 42 or 43 degrees, which is roughly the latitude of northern Spain, in a ship rigged for the tropics, with men dressed for the tropics. Snow, ice in the rigging. Then scurvy came back through a crew that had already had it once. 30 men died on that attempt. About 20 were left alive, and not all of those could stand a watch. After 5 months of it, they gave up and ran back downwind. On the way, they stopped at an island in the north of the Marianas, and 3 men slipped ashore and stayed. Whatever they were running from, they preferred it to the ship. The Trinidad came back to the Moluccas to find that a Portuguese fleet had arrived while she was away. An armed boarding party rowed out to take her, braced for a fight, and came over the rail into a hull that was barely floating, crewed by dying men, and took her without a blow. They stripped her at Ternate, took her rigging and her guns, and what was left of her was wrecked in a storm at anchor. The crew were made prisoners and moved from fort to fort, then to India, then eventually to Europe. 4 of them got home. It took years. And the 3 who jumped ship in the Marianas, 2 were killed. 1, a Galician named Gonzalo de Vigo, lived. He stayed 4 years, moved among the islands, and learned to speak Chamorro, the first European ever to do it. In 1526, a Spanish ship appeared, and he came out in a canoe and identified himself. He was pardoned and taken on as interpreter, and what he told them is the earliest description of those islands from someone who had actually lived in them. There's a story, reported rather than documented, that decades later, islanders were still calling his name out to Spanish ships. That part is a story. The 4 years are solid. Meanwhile, the other ship had been pumping since December. Elcano's decision was the harder one, and probably the only one that could have worked. No stops. Not Mozambique, not Madagascar, not anywhere with a Portuguese flag on it, which by then meant most of the Indian Ocean. He took the Victoria south, well south, into empty water, and ran west for months without touching land. Off the Cape, they spent 7 weeks trying to get round it against the wind. Some of the crew argued for putting into a Portuguese port and surrendering, on the grounds that prison was survivable, and this was not. They were overruled. That run left a ship with a hole in her and a crew too small to work her properly. It also left them out of food, which meant a stop they couldn't avoid. And it was the payment that gave them away. They had no coin. They paid the Portuguese for rice with cloves, and cloves do not grow anywhere in the Americas. Somebody ashore did that arithmetic. On the third trip in, one of their own men, standing on the beach, told the Portuguese officials the truth about where the ship had been. The Victoria was watching from the anchorage. When a boat put out toward her with armed men in it, they cut the cable and ran, with 13 of their people still on that island. 6 weeks later, on the 6th of September, 1522, she came over the bar at Sanlúcar. On the 8th, she was warped up the river to Seville and let off her guns. Stand on that quay. The ship coming alongside is filthy, weed-grown, low in the water, held together by 3 years of improvisation. And the men who come off her do not go to a tavern or to their families. They come ashore barefoot, in shirts, each carrying a lit candle, and they walk up through the city to 2 churches to keep a vow they had made somewhere at sea when they thought they were going to die. It's the first thing they do. There were 18 of them, and that number has been carved into every account since. It isn't the whole count. The 18 are the Europeans. The surviving lists record 3 or 4 men from the Moluccas who came off that ship as well, who had crossed the Indian and the Atlantic in her, and who are not in the famous number. Nor are the 13 left on the beach in the Cape Verdes, who were released later and got home, and who had by then also gone the whole way round. 18 is the count the clerks kept, and what the clerks were counting was Spaniards. Within days, the survivors were on the road inland to court to be questioned. Sit in that room at Valladolid. Clean floor, a table, a man with paper in front of him, and across from him a row of sailors who have been ashore for about a fortnight after 3 years and still don't fit indoors. The man asking the questions was Peter Martyr, an Italian humanist and the emperor's chronicler. His job was to write the official history of Spain's discoveries, and he'd spent 20 years interviewing men who came back from the Atlantic. He had heard every kind of sailor's story. He was not an easy audience. They told him about the day. He tried 3 ways to break it. First, your priests miscounted. Somewhere in 3 years, a chaplain lost track of the calendar, which happens. They said no. The reckoning was daily routine, kept by the men who stood the watches and checked. Second, you mistallied the hours. Long voyages, short watches, sick men, sloppy arithmetic. They said no. Third, and this is the one he clearly thought would land, you've forgotten that 1520 was a leap year. He put it to them directly. And they told him they had given February its 29 days, because of course they had. They had been at anchor in Patagonia at the time, with nothing to do but count. He could not break them. He wrote afterwards that these 18 men were altogether unlearned. Then he reported their claim to Rome as a thing that had happened. They won that argument without knowing why they were right. The explanation came from a Venetian envoy at the same court, an educated man who followed astronomy. He wrote it out in a letter to Venice. Sail west, chasing the sun, and every day you spend is very slightly longer than a day on shore, because you're moving with the rotation and putting off your own noon. Do that all the way around, and the little bits add up to exactly 1 whole day. He put it as a thought experiment. Send 2 fleets out from the same island on the same morning, 1 east and 1 west. When they meet again at the starting point, the 2 crews and the people who stayed behind will disagree about what day of the week it is. There will be 3 different answers among them. That is the correct explanation of the international dateline, written down in 1522. More than 3 centuries before anyone drew that line on a map. It came out of an argument with sailors, And I have to stop here and take something back. I've been telling you this as one man's voyage. It's how the story is always told, and it's how I set it up, and the documents will not carry it. Magellan's own papers went to Lisbon with the seized ship, and the Portuguese archive that would have held them was gutted in the earthquake and fire of 1755. The earliest report to reach Europe came from the deserters. The cosmographer's notebooks are gone. And the one full chronicle everything rests on, the book by the man who kept the date, never once names Juan Sebastián Elcano, the captain who brought the ship home. Not once in the entire manuscript. When the emperor asked Elcano to bring 2 of his crew to court, he did not bring Pigafetta either. Those 2 men crossed the world together in the same small ship, and each of them wrote the other out. The paperwork is where this ends. The islands. In 1529, the emperor sold his claim to the Moluccas to Portugal for 350,000 ducats, with a clause allowing Spain to buy it back if the boundary were ever properly proved. Nobody ever invoked the clause. The question the fleet was built to settle got settled by a payment. Elcano was given a coat of arms with a globe on it and a motto about being first around. He was also granted a pension of 500 ducats a year, charged against the revenues of a new spice house that was supposed to be set up in Galicia. The spice house never earned it. He never received a penny of the pension, and he died at sea in the Pacific in 1526 on another expedition. Lawsuits brought by the survivors and their heirs over unpaid wages were still moving through the courts in the 1540s. Whether the cargo paid for the voyage is still argued. Some accounts have it covering the whole cost of 5 ships and more. Others put the margin at almost nothing once the debts and the widow's claims were settled. The Victoria herself was auctioned in February 1523 to a Genoese merchant for 285 ducats. The first ship to go around the world sold at a loss. The book was worse off than the ship. Pigafetta's original manuscript is lost. A handful of handwritten copies survive, and no printed edition of the full text existed anywhere for nearly 3 centuries. The complete Italian version was found by a librarian in the Ambrosiana in Milan in 1797 and printed in 1800. Everything anyone knows about the day, the reef, the interpreter, and the Count of 18 comes from copies of a book nobody bothered to publish. And the birds. Pigafetta looked at them in the Moluccas and wrote plainly that they had legs. Europe received the trade skins, saw no feet on them, and decided they were creatures that never landed and lived their whole lives in the air. That belief outlasted the eyewitness and the evidence, and Linnaeus formally named the greater bird of paradise Paradisea apoda, which means footless. The man who had held one was overruled by men who had not. You can go and stand in front of some of this. Elcano's letter to the emperor, written the week he landed, is in the archive of the Indies in Seville, a few hundred meters from where the ship tied up. The wooden figure given at Cebu is still in Cebu. The reef where the commander died is a shrine, and since the quincentenary, the Philippine state has been careful to describe what happened there as a victory rather than a death. 5 ships went out, and 1 came back, and the only thing aboard her that survived the voyage undamaged was a 1-day error in a notebook. Pigafetta wrote that they knew not how they had fallen into error, and it is the most precise sentence in the book. The one place where somebody wrote down the moment of not understanding, instead of tidying it away later. The 18 were right, and couldn't say why. The scholar was wrong, and could argue beautifully. The eyewitness said the birds had legs, and got overruled by men holding a cut skin. The best navigator on the fleet was corrected by clerks writing down what the Crown wanted. Every time, the right answer was physically in the room and lost the argument anyway. Every time, somebody had to come back years or centuries later and check. Which leaves a question nobody has closed. A manuscript sat unread in Milan for 275 years. A set of notebooks was quoted once around the year 1600 and has not been seen since. An archive burned in Lisbon. Somewhere in the surviving paper, there are almost certainly people, numbers, and answers that nobody has looked at properly because the story already has a shape, and the shape doesn't need them. The cloves were unloaded and sold. The missing day is still there. If you made it this far, leave a like and subscribe.